in the meantime, let's start looking at global pool. Questions are always coming in. Carlos, if you can pull up the slide for global pool. We've been getting in your applications. Everything is looking great, guys. And we're thrilled by the quality and the incredible ideas from over 194 countries at this point. Don't forget, you still have a couple more weeks to get in your additional deliverables for Global Pool. So any questions, concerns, etc., you can go on the EWC platform. There's tons of information in the FAQs and, of course, the discussion board. And all of us are always there for you to answer any specific questions you may have. So without any further ado, I'm really excited to kick off this week's topic. We had the pleasure of getting to know the awesome people leading GenSpace over the last year as they've traversed the universe, explaining that space and the industry that's being created around astropreneurship is not just for people who have PhDs in astrophysics or engineering. It's really for all of us. And almost all of the countries that are part of our Gen Network and EWC have some kind of application, program, partnership going on so that their countries can get involved in the space industry. So who better to share the opportunities for each of us in understanding this vast new universe than Captain Stefan Recke and Brandon Seifert, who run GenSpace. One of the great things about both of them is their goal in making this, what may seem like a very daunting new opportunity, really accessible to all of us, and understanding where all of these pieces can fit together. So your current business, your interests may align, and it might be part of you getting involved in what's starting to be one of the most exciting and growing industries that we're seeing internationally. So welcome, guys. We're so happy to have you here. I'll turn it over to you so you can start explaining what you're seeing and the nuts and bolts of making sure that we all know you can be part of it. And then we'll start Q&A as soon as you're ready.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Susan. Thanks for the opportunity and a pleasure to be speaking to the group here. We're super excited to share our energy and our passion about space. As you mentioned, Brandon and I started and co-founded GenSpace a couple of years ago, and we've had the opportunity and the pleasure of circumventing the globe. We haven't been to space yet, but it's not on my plans, but I'm sure it's on Brandon's plans to get to space. Brandon, do you want to say a couple of words and we can maybe go into aspects of space?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Co-founded this with Stefan a few years ago. I've got a long background in entrepreneurship and space entrepreneurship in particular myself. And the driving thesis behind why we decided to come together and build this was because Stefan, as an investor, and myself as startup employee, startup founder, startup supporter, and operator, had a network of people all around the world that were trying to create and support startups in space. And some people had all this expertise and capabilities in one area and all these needs and problems over here, and then someone else had something complementary in a different part of the world. And there wasn't necessarily a good way for everybody to get to meet each other and help out and start to move this whole thing forward. And so we're glad to now have an infrastructure that we can use to help connect people and knowledge and resources to make the journey easier for people everywhere.
So one of the things about space, if you know something about history, it started way back when, right? So actually a derivative of World War II rockets. Through the years, it's evolved into commercialization. So it started first in military, and then there was a space race between the Soviet Union and the US and America. But the biggest challenge that we've seen and we're trying to address with GenSpace is there still kind of is a space race. It's still very individualized in terms of countries or different organizations. And what we're trying to do is build a very open, founder-friendly network for entrepreneurs that want to do business in space. So we're looking at space as not just a vertical, but it's a location to do business. And one of the cool things in a couple, maybe we'll mention a couple of slides, is you don't have to be just a rocket scientist anymore to do business in space. As Susan was mentioning, we're really trying to promote space to be super accessible, all ages, all industries, all types of specialties. Should we just go through the slides, Susan, as we get questions, because we can't see the questions? Okay. Brandon, do you want to
go
jump
ahead.
in? Sure, yeah. You want to jump to the next slide? There we go. Yeah, so this is, I guess we could get into a little bit more detail just to give you all some context for who we are, building on what I just shared earlier. So we've grown from just Stefan and myself to a pretty remarkable team of space people all around the world, every continent except for Antarctica, and for now, and comprising of entrepreneurs, investors, employees, engineers, astronauts, top and the bottom of the ladder everywhere. It takes a village to make this kind of thing happen. And so we have worked with various countries, we've worked with different organizations, we've worked with different founders and startups to help them, find the talent they need, the resources they need, whether that's building, an engagement strategy or some kind of internal business strategy, or working with an economic development organization at the national level to help review and redline and tailor and build and act on space policy. So jump to the next slide. Unless Stefan, you have something you'd like to say.
Again, the big thing we want to really emphasize is you don't have to be a rocket scientist, right? So if you're interested in doing some entrepreneurship, we'll talk more about it, but it's really trying to open it up. And also we're highly motivated to excite kids and inspire them to look at the next generation workforce. So we want to make space and doing business in space as diverse as possible.
Mm-hmm. So we don't need to spend too much time on this slide here. I just wanted to throw this out again for a little bit more context, because I really want to spend most of this time, conversing and taking questions and actually discussing things with you all. But just to give you a little bit more of an idea, when we say space, we don't just mean space. We don't just mean orbital environment or beyond, or Mars and things. What this is meant to show here on the slide is that, we're really talking about the entire value chain of space exploration and development, which includes, things happening here on Earth from, finding people, building teams, building companies and operating those, or inventing the technology, or, repurposing technologies that were made for space to solve problems that are here down on Earth, all the way up through the problems of, moving from Earth to space. Then doing things in space that directly affect, and improve our lives here on Earth, like climate tracking, communications, resource monitoring, human trafficking monitoring, illegal fishing activities and things like that. All the way up to the space for space segment, which includes businesses that are focused on solving unique problems in space for space architectures, whether this is moving and maintaining satellites in the orbital environment and orbital debris, or developing propulsion technologies for next generation satellites, or next generation habitats and environmental modules for space stations, or for settlements on the moon or Mars. There's a lot more going on in space than a lot of people are aware of. And I think that's part of what's happening right now, or what's making it right now so much more of an accessible thing for non-engineers as well as for interested entrepreneurs.
So last century, the biggest prohibitive factor of doing business in space was cost. These days, the governments, various space agencies, and different entities are funding access to space. So if you wanted to get something sent to space, you probably could find through your local space agency some way to get it up either for free or for cheap. Also, as Brandon's mentioning, it's not necessarily just getting something into space, it's getting access to space, doing stuff with data. One of the things that we do, Brandon and I, is we go around the world talking to folks to inspire them about space. And typically we talk about what's a day in your life with regards to space. Maybe the easier way to look at it is, what's a day in your life without access to space? If you know how to use maps, you'd probably be fine. But without space, you probably wouldn't be able to get to where you want to go. If you're in the dating world and you wanted to date someone and use an app, well, again, without space, you wouldn't be able to get connected to those other people. Whether it's communications, whether it's understanding what the weather is going to be and understanding where the dangers are going to be, whether they're hurricanes or different world events that you want to find out, day without space would be pretty hard to survive.
Jump to the next slide. So that's it. That's all that we wanted to do when it came to like formal presentation, because we're not about, you know, talking, we're about listening and discussing. So with that, you know, I want to open it up to any questions or, you know, things on your mind, Susan, or to the audience.
Well, I think a great place to start is actually a conversation we had a while ago, which is what kinds of industries are being affected by this. And Brandon had an awesome example of a company that was licensing materials, fabric from NASA. But I know this is kind of like everything is being affected, from food to clothing and everything in between. So can you give us some examples of real life businesses that may seem traditional, but are using technologies or opportunities that we're learning from the industry to change the way we're working right now on Earth?
Mm-hmm. Stefan, you want to take the first stab at that?
Well, a lot of it is the data, right? So it's figuring out the location stuff, figuring out predictions, figuring out things such as protecting the oceans, protecting wildlife, or you can determine when things are being poached or when things are being overfished, those kind of things. But primarily to enable businesses, it's the data that comes from the GPS satellites, right? So the location-based is first and foremost one of the most important aspects of access to space that's been figured out today, and looking at figuring out how to maybe make it quicker, more efficient. One of the big things that you might have heard in the news is we're putting together internet based on spacecraft. So giving access to the whole world to internet cheaply or affordably or even for free, depending on where you are, through a basis of a network of satellites.
That's unbelievable. And Brandon, I would love for you to share that example you gave a couple of weeks ago and other things that you're seeing, because I know you're like in the thick of it.
Yeah. So that first clothing company is a company called Ministry of Supply, based in Boston, and they're licensing some of the materials that were developed to create different parts of the Apollo astronaut suits, and they're making clothing out of it, which is really cool. That whole athleisure thing is a trend right now. But you know, that's just an example. You know, there are a lot of other companies. There's just HVAC companies, just companies that build heating and cooling, you know, ventilation systems for buildings, residential or commercial, that leverage, you know, materials developments and filtration and fibers and things like that. Or companies that work with NASA to or other space agencies as well, or even private companies too, that are generating Earth observation data. They're taking images in different parts of the spectrum, and people are developing software to analyze those images and find people that are, you know, in parts of the world that they shouldn't be, you know, maybe illegal fishing, or they're able to look at some of the climate data and, you know, potentially predict like, you know, there's probably going to be a drought in this area of some way, shape, or form. You know, maybe we need to start figuring out, you know, how to talk about the upcoming water problem there. Or they're able to look at, you know, farmlands, and from the data that they can collect, determine the health of the plants and figure out, you know, maybe, you know, this part of the field needs more of this part of the field needs less of this, or something like that. So the benefits and the opportunities, they aren't just in, you know, building a better rocket. It's not just about building spaceships. It's about figuring out how you can change lives here on Earth, using some of the technologies, you know, whether they were created for space or by a space project, to solve things here on Earth where we are right now.
Well, as we take a step back, you know, in the last couple of weeks, there were some really monumental historical new opportunities in the space industry created because of the SpaceX launch. And a lot of people may not realize all the historical relevance for what it means for us as humankind. Could you share a little bit of that? I know Brandon was lucky enough to be there for the launch. What did that mean for us as the world, as opposed to just how awesome it was for US space?
You want to take that first, Stefan, or you want me to go for it?
You were there, Brandon. So
Sure. Yeah, I'll take it. I mean, I could go on and on about how like personally and emotionally exciting that is, but keeping this within the scope of the conversation that we're having today, which is about entrepreneurs and startups. One of the more interesting insights that I kind of took away from this experience and how exciting it is that this is validation of the fact that a VC-backed, high intensity, very challenging, kind of market creating startup can be successful, and that, against all odds and against all naysayers, whether that was coming from NASA or other VCs or other space companies or whatever, can set a plan and go and do it and make money on it. And then make even more money on that. This is a demonstration mission, and now that they've successfully proved this, they can act on a bunch of follow-up contracts with NASA that they had lined up, contingent on the success of this mission. So that's the biggest thing for me wearing my startup, my entrepreneur hat, is that a win of this caliber for a VC-backed startup is a win for any VC-backed or investor-backed or bootstrapped startup in this space, and it's a reminder that you can do it.
I think also it's a reminder that you can think of something and want to do it and feel basically the motivation and the inspiration to do it. So Musk wanted to get to space. Musk wants to go to Mars. Yes, he's a billionaire and has the funding and the deep pockets of both himself and also the investors, but it's a reinforcement that it's no longer requirements to have a government sponsored entity do everything and all to get the whatever you're trying to do to space. So it's pretty inspiring there, and it's opening up the doors, and it's also a great public relations visibility for space. So now people realize, and a lot of people even thought that NASA wasn't around, or that space shuttles might have been flying. There was a lot of misconceptions. So this really reinforced, and NASA has an amazing press engine and a website and social media engine. They had so many viewers, and you guys were lucky enough to be there in person, but it was just very, very well received across the globe.
I think it was shocking to a lot of us when there were so many wonderful interviews going on the few days before, especially as we were waiting for the launches to be rescheduled. The length of time it took from, I have an idea, we're doing this, to finally this amazing opportunity, and the number of lessons learned over time. So many of us are used to like that lean startup approach where we're testing and iterating over a weekend. This was 13, 15 years in the making. And the number of things that went wrong to ultimately have this victory, my gosh, the amount of patience and focus that needs to be there was really inspirational for me. Could either of you speak to that? Because it's a totally different, very long-term mindset, even longer than, biomedical devices and some of the things that some of us already think is just a crazy horizon.
Sure. Yeah. And I'll answer that, or we'll answer that for sure. But I also want to say that just to reinforce part of the point that we're making here is like, that's just one kind of space startup. They aren't all like that. Like some of them are a little bit more familiar or traditional with their development cycles and their timelines and their capital requirements. And so, yes, on one end of the spectrum, you have, billionaire founded hardware infrastructure, like reinventing the railroad for space kind of company. But then on the other end of the spectrum, you have software, things that you can do in your home, things that you don't need to raise hundreds of millions of dollars for. But to get back to your question though, can you say that again?
Sure. The time horizon was amazing. And the fact that those team members had worked for so long and through so many iterations and through so many test flights, it wasn't like this flight was the first big thing. There were so many pieces to get to this place where it's manned. It's really inspirational to have that level of focus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Stefan, you want to go for that first?
Yeah, well, it's so what you're basically painting is a very patient process, right? So it was cost intensive and patient, and as we're getting down the road, it's getting shorter and shorter cycles. It did require a lot of testing, and before the big motto for NASA was failure is not an option. And the good news about being an entrepreneur is failure is an option as long as you're able to address why you failed and what you learned from it and got better. So yeah, they were very, 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 very careful about putting people on the spaceship. But I've actually witnessed SpaceX 7 explode upon launch, and it just had cargo. So they went through a lot of trials and testing, and that's again like Brandon's saying, as an example of making hardware, you're probably going to have a long cycle for development and testing, but there are other things you can do in space that aren't going to require that, and that's what we're trying to help promote as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I know you guys have been up close and personal with people from astronauts to ministers doing space work all over the world. Where do you see opportunities? I mean, everybody talks about NASA and how much R&D and how many things are created in the US, which is awesome. But where are you seeing other hotbeds of activity that's getting you excited from an ecosystem perspective, whether it's a region or a city or a country? Where else are you seeing really exciting things happening all over the world?
It's truly global. So as Brandon's mentioned, our Gen Space board is in every continent. I mean, we have Alishaya, who's in Nigeria, who ran the NASA Space Apps Challenge in Africa. We have folks in Singapore. We have folks in Japan. There's a big push for for countries to enter into the space world, to start space agencies. We're seeing a big push in the Middle East. We're working with Bahrain, with the Saudis, with UAE. And ESA has a very good foothold on all the countries in Europe. And the countries in Europe all are putting together, part of the European Commission, business incubation centers. So you can actually, within your country, figure out how do you do business in space and do something locally in that country. So it really, really, Susan, it's truly becoming global. And as Brandon has mentioned, everything except for we haven't seen much in Antarctica yet.
But that's one of the things I think is so beautiful. When I think about the International Space Station, the ISS, and how it doesn't matter where you're an astronaut from, you're working together and really thinking about the problems of Earth and the problems of the future of humanity. I think that that's a universal message that people who may not understand the industry may not see as clearly, that it's truly borderless. Can you speak to that? Because I think that's such an important part of your message of accessibility.
Sure, and I also want to be honest and not try to just paint a romantic picture over this entire thing, and acknowledge the fact that on one hand that's very true. It's all about collaboration. It's very global. I mean, space is equidistant from everybody on the surface. But on the other hand, you have to acknowledge the history of it, and like Stefan said earlier, how it came out of this post-war effort, and it was very heavily entrenched in national security technology development. And the way that that's manifested over the time is that some of it isn't borderless. There are some countries aren't allowed to work together. Some information you're not allowed to share. Some things you can't collaborate on. But to break through that, that's why I'm excited about this commercial revolution in space exploration and development. Is that the problems that can be solved by doing things in space aren't just felt by militaries and countries anymore. I mean, these are problems that are being solved by companies for other companies or for private individuals, and talent is developing globally, and experts are all over the place now. And so it's less focused on what can I and my team do, and it's more about, like those people over there are very good at that thing, like they have that infrastructure, or like they have that money or whatever. And figuring out how to bridge those gaps. And that is forcing new discussions on policy and laws and what you're allowed to do in space and what you're allowed to do here on Earth to build those things in space. You know, I won't say that the barriers don't exist, but I will say that the barriers are changing, and they're starting to fall. And that's a trend that I hope continues as driven by entrepreneurial space activity.
And two things. So we have resident astronauts on our board, and what you're referring to, Susan, is the overview effect. So when you're actually in space, you look from a spacecraft onto the Earth and you don't see borders, and you kind of question, why is all this strife going on between borders and border conflict and whatnot? And from the people that we've spoken to that come back from doing, whether being in a spacecraft going to the ISS or spending time on the ISS, their lives change. They come back and they realize that we're also in a very fragile state, or the world is very fragile. There's only a very thin blue line that protects the Earth, and it gives us the ability to survive based on the atmosphere. Sorry, my printer is going off here. So that's the number one. Number two is that there's all these industrial revolutions that have gone on, right? And we really feel that the fourth industrial revolution has been extended or is extending to space. Sorry about that. I'm standing right next to my printer and it decides to talk. So I think there's definitely a lot of cool things that when you actually get access to space and realize that you're trying to do things outside of this world, you have the opportunity to do that. And that's what we're trying to promote.
So it would be great if you can explain a little bit more about what this SpaceX mission to Mars is all about, because we hear that as a, you know, rallying cry, and that's the direction. Why is that so important? And what does that tell us about kind of the future of the industry as far as where entrepreneurs and potential participants may be headed?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, if we're gonna start it off just focusing on SpaceX, I mean, it's simple as just, this is something that they want to do as a company. It's something that Elon Musk personally cares about. He wants to go to Mars. He thinks it's important for the future of, you know, humanity's survivability to become interplanetary. You know, this isn't like a business pitch that he's trying to work on. This is him genuinely trying to change the world by making another world. And so that's a very, you know, emotional, philosophical thing, which I know is an element of entrepreneurship, but to open up the scope a little bit broader and just talk about, you know, Martian exploration in general, and the fact that not only does SpaceX want to go there, but NASA wants to go there, and, you know, there are plenty of other companies and agencies and organizations that want to, and people that want to go there too. I just think it's just another, it's the latest manifestation of people wanting to explore and wanting to go make new things and wanting to go be in a new place for the first time. And that is spurring all sorts of new technological and business creativity and development, because we're coming across problems that we have never come across before, you know, trying to do things and live in environments that are nothing like the environments here on Earth.
So to carry that out a little bit, we're actually talking about potentially living there and migrating. So if you can explain that as a concept, whether it's SpaceX or any of these other organizations that will be able to create that opportunity, it'd be really good to understand the why behind it.
It's also, it's creating society, right? Off-world society. So it's all the aspects of making sure that we all are able to survive on Earth. And actually, if you think about it, Earth is a planet. So we are on a spaceship, right? We are on the spaceship Earth, traveling around the sun. So what does it take to actually put together all the aspects of society to migrate over to Mars? Just something as simple. I mean, they're creating industries now, space sociologists, space psychologists. You're going to be in a spaceship for 6 to 9 months. How do you keep your mind busy? How do you keep alert? How do you keep excited? How do you do all the different things that you do on Earth and extend them to different planets? It's pretty fun and pretty cool. It's, again, it's not just technology. It's all the other aspects.
It's a people problem. Yeah.
Well, we have some questions coming in from YouTube and Facebook, and so let's get started. So there's an agriculture company asking, how can my agriculture company benefit from addressing space needs or learning from your industry, especially before I have funding to test myself in that environment?
What kind of agriculture? I guess I would have to ask. Are you building mechanical or robotic systems to automate, crop monitoring or control? Or are you, developing new strains of seeds? Or what kind of agriculture? Because it could go in so many different directions. There's a lot.
Sure. Carlos, if you can get a little bit more information about the company who's asking, that'll be great. We can do another question while we wait to get that back from you. Okay, next question. I'm interested in thinking about pivoting into space. I can see how we can position ourselves into the industry, but it's very intimidating. How do you deal with handling imposter syndrome?
Stefan, do you want to talk to that before I go on a little rant? Or?
Yeah. Well, I would say, first of all, addressing the imposter syndrome. The reason you might want to pivot into space is because you are probably going to be good at what you want to do in space. So feel confident. I mean, if you feel like you're getting into space just for the sake of doing something in space, don't do it. If you feel like you have some added value, and I'm talking also with my investor hat on, I can clearly see through someone wanting to do space just to say marketing their company to do something in space versus actually solving a problem, or more so as an investor, are you going to make a business that's going to thrive on your access to space? So don't be an imposter. Figure out what the complete situation is in terms of the business plan, the business reason why you're doing that thing in space. Present it, feel good about it, and then grow your company.
I'm excited for Brandon's rant now. Go ahead, Brandon.
Yeah, it's not going to be a rant because I thought about it. I guess just to kind of keep it, short and sweet, and then we can take this a little bit further if they want to ask other questions or whatever. But specifically on the note of the whole imposter syndrome thing, and Stefan, started to touch on this nicely. A little cheesy motto that I have for myself is that competence is confidence, and the best way to feel better about your positioning, about yourself, about your ability to pivot your company and move into a space that you're not quite sure you should or could, is to learn about it, ask about it, connect with people, like get, different kinds of inputs and validation or invalidation even, see what you can learn from the world and other people to help you iterate on and develop your idea or develop your thesis or really figure out what the appropriate strategy is for you to move and stay in that space, if that's even the right thing to do at all. And again, that's part of why we created Gen Space, is to enable those kinds of connections to happen, that kind of mentorship to occur, helping people break through that shell and realize that this is something that you can do. Yeah, I mean, that's the imposter syndrome thing is something that happens to people personally and professionally, or people and companies. Whether you're talking about imposter syndrome yourself as a founder or the syndrome, for your company, like, can my company do this? Is my company capable of being the player that we want it to be? Best way to combat that is to learn and apply what you learn, and then learn more.
So how do you find technical talent? How do you find partners, collaborators, team members and I know that's a big part of Gen Space, being that convener through all the conferences and everything you guys are engaged with, and always being so accessible to people, which is so appreciated. But how do we find good team members when we want to make that transition or assess what opportunities there might be for our companies in the space industry?
I think the big thing is we spend a lot of time going to trade shows and industry groups, telling folks, and a lot of the people that attend those are people that are in existing space companies, maybe they're big space companies, just giving them opportunities and telling them that you can be an entrepreneur in space. So if you're an existing employee of a big space company and you have an idea and you want to put a business around it, the big fear has always been, it's so expensive, it's so time prohibitive, I can't start my own business, my own company. We're trying to alleviate that and educate. educate the folks that you can start your own business.
Brandon, I know you've actually started lots of companies in the space industry as well, and have been a co-founder, et cetera. How do you start to test and validate somebody else's knowledge to see what kind of fit there is in building those teams, especially when it's so technical?
Mm-hmm. For the record, I've only been a founder once, but I've helped other people be founders many times. How do I approach that people problem? Finding talent and building those teams. I started early. I started patiently. I started very carefully. Again, I'm trying to scope our answers and our conversation here around entrepreneurship, around being a founder or an early stage influencer or supporter of a founder. And so the advice that I'm trying to give is very much focused from the founder's perspective. At the end of the day, the company isn't its technology. It's not the problem it's trying to solve or its suite of solutions. It's not the contracts that it has or the revenue channels. It's the people and the team and the culture and who they've selected and how they've built that and how they do or do not stick to that culture or their morals or their ideals. It's how do you treat each other as a team, and how do you treat the other people on the other teams from the other companies that you work with. So when I'm looking at people, when I'm evaluating people, when I'm sourcing people, I start with the people that I know. I start with my network, and then I ask them who they know. And I take the time to get to know these people as people, by their name, not by their title or by their degree. Now, of course, you need to, validate competency. You need to know that people can actually do their job or learn to do their job, within an appropriate amount of time. But to keep my answer, as short as I can, I focus on learning the people, as they are. What's their philosophy? How do they live their life? How do they learn things? How do they help other people learn things? And I've found that when you focus on those kind of fundamental things, everything else starts to fall into place.
I think that was a really great answer. And it's so important because the people you're going to meet with Gen Space and hopefully most of the people we bring before you guys, these are really authentic, honest people who care about ethics and presenting information that's going to best help you. And the fact that Brandon has a very unique perspective with experience, and he's so laser targeted in on what you need to hear. I kind of want to pose a similar question to Stefan, because Stefan's been a VC in this space as well. So Stefan, how do you start to evaluate those founders who are coming to you with sometimes what seem like really big ideas, but they could also be really simple things that there's that need in the industry, but that people side that Brandon just talked about? I mean, it always comes down to the ethics and how clear and direct and honest the people are, no matter what the idea is. Can you speak to that as a potential investor looking at lots of different opportunities every month sometimes?
Yeah, and you're hitting it right on the head, both of you, in terms of, well, first of all, investors invest in people, right? It's a business, but the business consists of people, right? And it's two-sided. Just remember, investors are people too, right? Unless it's a bank, but even a bank is people. Bank has employees that are people. So it has to be human on both sides. So the story has to be understood, has to be expressed properly, and so there has to be some reason why the investor is going to invest in you. So again, I always emphasize, I don't invest in ideas, I invest in businesses. So think of a business you can create in space, and there's lots of them. Think of some reasonable business you can create in space that's not going to be an arm and a leg. And always remember, you're going to be competing with other folks that are in the head of that investor that they're looking at opportunities. I spend a lot of time talking to investors about investing in space. The majority of the investors I speak to aren't space investors, and they never knew that they could invest in space. So they didn't even know that this opportunity exists. They just thought it's the 4 billionaires in the world are putting their money into space and they can never be part of it. So they get excited about it. So it really is, and getting back to that imposter syndrome question, don't be an imposter. Understand what your capabilities are, and to what Brandon's saying, figure out who do you need to fill the picture of making that business successful. What other skills, what other people, present that as a group or as a business to an investor, and ultimately, if it's a sound story, the investor should make that clear decision to invest in the company. It's not, it shouldn't be complicated, and it should be human.
So a couple of interesting other questions have come in. One of them on this call, what type of business model can be utilized in the space? Sorry, I'm going to reread it. What type of business model can utilize space technology? So the space thing is vague to me. Can you explain it in simple terms that a child or a layman can understand? So can you give examples of different business models that can work here?
Sure, I'll take a step. Unless Stefan, you got something on the top of your head.
Jump right in. And, yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So one example here. I'll start off with. It's a startup, or was a startup, that was founded by a group of people that took their idea, prototype, launched, demonstrated, and then grew it into this huge company that's now one of like the biggest companies in the commercial space ecosystem. It's called Planet. It used to be called Planet Labs. And they have designed and built a constellation of small satellites. So just a huge network of very small satellites that they keep in a particular orbit around the Earth. And their whole business model is predicated on taking a new picture of the entire surface of the Earth once every 24 hours. Now, what they've done on top of that is they've built this internal team of experts who are, incredible data analysts, data scientists, computer scientists, and they're able to sell that data, the raw imagery that they take, but then they're also able to provide insights and analysis and help other kinds of customers take that information and learn things from it, whether it's, watching where ships might be going, or what's the traffic like in this area, or if your customers, like a military agency, what happened, at that site somewhere, what kind of movement was there, what was tested. So it's at the end of the day, it's building really tall towers and taking pictures from them, and then looking at those pictures very, very carefully, and then selling the insights from those pictures. So that's one, startup model. Start with a group of people that put an iPhone in a satellite and put it in space, and were able to take a picture and move it around using the iPhone's gyroscope. And now I've raised tons of money and have huge contracts. Another example of a very space-heavy startup is a company called Rocket Lab. And they've developed this rocket architecture where they're able to build much smaller rockets than what you would normally see someone like NASA or United Launch Alliance or, Roscosmos or something launch. They're only like a couple stories tall. And they launch very, very small satellites into lower orbits. Of course, they want to launch them into, deeper orbits later, but all they do is provide a delivery service from the surface of the Earth to an orbit. They just take a thing and move it from point A to point B, and they charge for that service. So space isn't that complicated when you actually look at the fundamental business models that a lot of these companies are operating on. They're solving age-old problems, moving things, seeing things, keeping things where they should be, being able to talk to someone, and instead of sending a letter, you send bits through a satellite. And so you've got ones and zeros instead of ink on a paper, and you're just relaying it through a satellite instead of, a post office. It's just trying to solve those problems in an entirely new environment.
And it should be simple, right? So the business model that you present as a space entrepreneur should be simple and scalable, right? If it's something that's going to take 10 years and again, 10 or 15 years to launch one rocket and billions of dollars, maybe you'll make a lot of money then, but it has to be simpler. So the idea is we're trying to promote to the folks that are listening to us is think of something simple that can be accomplished in space as a business and is scalable. And ideally, what I like looking at as an investor is explain to me in very layman terms. So I don't need to be a nuclear physicist or a rocket scientist to understand what you're trying to do. Explain to me why that business is going to be successful, not just for the company, not for me as an investor, but for the world. It'd be really cool if you could think of something, a business you can do with space as a location, that will benefit the world. That's a triple play in my mind.
That's perfect. It's really fascinating how it can be as simple or complex as needed. And one of the other things that the new opportunities may be when you're looking at, you might be an architect on Earth, the types of housing, furniture, everything that's needed for a house here is needed there. So it might be the simple business case of somebody hires you to design what a new housing unit may be, or how beds will be so that it can support you and keep you more comfortable, or the seating within the rockets for the 6 to 9 months as you're traveling to Mars. So I don't overthink it, guys. Whatever your business model may be on Earth may work in this industry. It may be that your initial contract comes from a government or from a university or through a grant challenge at first. So just because it seems more complex doesn't mean the business model needs to be. It might be that your customer is different, or how to reach them, or that you win a contest versus you kind of competing within a store. But there's a lot of room there. And the more creative you are, Brendan, can you share with them about your friend who does PR for space companies? I think that was such a great example.
Yeah. My buddy, I wouldn't call him a buddy, actually. I would love to be buddies with him. He's a very cool guy. I don't get to spend enough time with him. His name's Andrew Sloan, and he runs a company called Cosma Schema. And his whole operating thesis is that everybody does the same thing in space from a design perspective. They're all blue. They're all swooshes. All their logos look the same. All their languages are the same. They're always given the same old narratives. Like, none of their stories are different. Why? Why are the color palettes the same? Why are the fonts the same? Why is everybody stuck in this age-old trope of old-timey space aesthetic? And so he works with companies to be creative, revitalize that, do something new, like change their branding, change their messaging, change their language. And he's a designer. He makes beautiful stuff, and has built this really cool practice on the side that specializes in marketing and communications and aesthetic design for space companies. So another great example of a space business on Earth.
And there was an advertising company, if you've heard of Ogilvy. So a couple of years ago, they had a charter to become the first ad agency for space. So if you wanted to put an ad in space, they wanted to be the people for you to go to.
And I mentioned earlier, my kids and me growing up, I always loved astronaut ice cream. So when you're thinking about foods you love and special ways of doing things, and how food in the, for space travel needs to be reconstituted in simple ways, and needs to be able to travel in certain ways, and even farming and how things are being tested using all of the opportunities on the ISS and the researchers and scientists there, it really can be anything you can imagine. So don't overcomplicate it and think that it has to be some crazy new way of doing things. It's about finding the things you love and coupling them for a new industry. So hopefully that's helpful.
On that note, I'm an advisor for a company called Mission Space Food, and it's founded by some chefs as well as a scientist. And their goal is to make savory treats that are small and nutritious based on the food that's been going up to space, and also to supply not just space travelers with food that tastes good and is exciting to eat, but also to figure out how to solve problems with nutrition back on Earth.
That's an awesome example. Okay, so how will this commercialization of space affect the security systems of different countries?
I'm assuming that the question is defense, right? If it's in that regards of defense, yes. Actually, so Brandon alluded to this, there's actually different policies that countries have restricting, there is a restriction for cooperation in space, given that you can't expose security secrets for that specific country. Also, the United Nations has been involved and is getting involved with outer space affairs. So they're becoming the peacekeepers or putting together peace policies or peacekeeping policies for the fair use of space, whether it's for garbage disposal, like atomic disposal, or missiles, or between countries, and also asteroid mining.
Mm-hmm. I mean, to answer the question as well, to expand on that a little bit more, I mean, it's not that, you know, national security and military operations are just now being affected by space. That was ground zero, to, you know, that was the launch pad, to use a pun. You know, military interests have always influenced, in fact, pretty much created the actual manifestation of space programs and space interests and space technologies, and vice versa. Space stuff has always, you know, affected military strategies and ideas and operations. I mean, the most recent manifestation here in the United States is the creation of the Space Force, which I know is a meme and a joke now. It was great, and it was a very funny show. But that dynamic has always existed, and it's always been very dynamic, and it's always been very, very, very significant. And you know, unless something fundamentally changes in, you know, how we recognize different countries as nation states and how we do diplomacy and how we operate as a human species, that dynamic's not going to go away anytime soon. It's going to continue to be a competition and a race. It's just that the players in that competition might change over time.
So I know NASA does a lot of technology and then can license out R&D to normal people, normal companies wanting to commercialize some of the technology. Are there other space agencies or other governments that you see doing that tech transfer commercialization activity at that level?
Yeah, absolutely. ESA is doing that as well for Europe. So as I mentioned, they have this business incubation center, and they're working on getting their IP accessible. They're also giving away the data from their satellites and enabling entrepreneurs to put together businesses to manipulate the data. So there's a Copernicus Masters program, which deals with the data from different satellites that Europe has up in space as well.
And I know you guys are doing a really cool program with one of your advisory board members about thinking like an entrepreneur. Can you share a little bit about that and other places where people who are novices to the industry can learn more, take a certificate, take a course? Where do we start?
Well, I'd say, first of all, visit GenSpace, register there. We can put you in touch with as different programs come up, looking at doing some webinar series, newsletters, those kind of things. We're formulating the best way to communicate to our, basically our membership group for GenSpace about opportunities to do business in space.
Mm-hmm. And to be an entrepreneur, an astropreneur, an entrepreneur in space, you don't necessarily need to go to a program specifically for space. You know, you can go and develop your entrepreneurial experience elsewhere and then move into space. Some of my favorite startups right now, you know, were either founded entirely or partially by entrepreneurs that had no background in space. They weren't even engineers. One of my favorite ones, one of the chief co-founders was an accountant. And you know, had a huge background in legal stuff. He was a lawyer as well at some point, and built his, you know, small fortune on some like legal technology software. So you can go learn to be an entrepreneur by doing it, by going to, you know, accelerators or incubators and coming up with ideas, or going to programs, you know, learning at school or whatever. A lot of different ways that you can do that, and there's no single right way to do that. It's whatever's the most appropriate for you. When it comes to learning more about space, it depends on what you want to learn. I mean, there are some more casual, like financially and like academically approachable programs where you can get certificates or just go learn some things casually. There's quite a few online resources, you know, YouTube classes. You know, some universities make a lot of their classes freely accessible. You won't get your degree, but you can take their classes, like MIT and Harvard. But then there also are like more rigorous programs that you can go through as well. There's things like the International Space University, you know, is the first example that comes to mind, where you can, you know, got different calibers of programs for technical or business oriented interests, where you can go through and get a very detailed crash course about how to do business in the space industry. So there are a lot of different options out there. I definitely would not say that I think that there's a missing gap, at least that I'm aware of, in the education world, holistically speaking. You just got to do the research to go find what's right for you.
And
Another,
Stefan, oh, please go ahead.
yeah, sorry. I was going to say another example. Brendan and I both have footholds in Colorado, and the University of Colorado in Boulder 2 years ago started a space minor program. So you could be majoring in anything that the university offers and get a minor in space. So that's pretty cool.
That's great.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned the Gen Space website. So can you tell everybody the name, the URL for that?
Sure,
I'll
it's
put
really
it in the
easy.
chat. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's really easy. It's GenSpace, GenSpace.co.
.co. So
Dot co.
guys, check that out. I just put it in the chat. So if anybody wants to find it, you can find that really easily there. So we're running out of time. I would love for you to share any last minute thoughts on if you were a young person looking at this for the first time, what trends or what areas do you see the most excitement to actually pull young people in? What are you seeing as things that can actually be something, a link or something that can be easily shared to really make sure that this becomes something all of us feel like we can be part of, and it's part of all of our futures?
I'm thinking, Brandon, do you have something that jumps out? What's the coolest thing that they can touch?
There's so many. The space industry is so active on Twitter, just ridiculously, embarrassingly active on Twitter. All the CEOs, all the engineers, all the politicians, all the influencers, the founders, the employees. I mean, I can't tell you how many of my friends have found jobs or gotten jobs by just reaching out to people or companies on Twitter. You know, information gets released, you know, unofficially there before press releases happen. You know, CEOs argue with each other over technical details, and it's all public. It's great and it's free, which blows me away. I don't really have like a specific answer for you.
That's a fantastic answer.
The one recommendation that I would make is you know, get on Twitter and just watch, just listen. You don't even need to participate. But the resources, the recommendations, the people, the rising, the falling, the announcements, whatever, like it all played out like a movie on Twitter. It's crazy.
No, I'm really glad you mentioned that, because that's part of why it's so exciting that it is so accessible now. The fact that you're having these exchanges in real time, and all of us can be like flies on the wall for the future of what may be mankind in some of these decisions. It's really amazing to think about. Awesome.
Yeah,
Stefan, what else?
We have a partnership. So GenSpace has a partnership with a group called, it's part of NASA. So it's a national, International Space Apps Challenge from NASA. So another website for you to look at is spaceappschallenge.org. I believe they have 150 countries that participate with tens of thousands of entrepreneurs annually. They just did a COVID-19 challenge to figure out what can you do relative to whatever's going on in space to help the world address COVID-19. So things like that. So it's part of NASA, but there's also some industry companies like Booz Allen Hamilton that are sponsoring it. So it's a really good way to get into the space business.
I have a good last question to finish on. How huge will the potential of garbage disposal in space be? Any thoughts?
There are companies that are actively trying to prepare to solve that problem today. And in a sense, it already is a problem. Well, I guess okay, hold on. Let me back up for a second. If you're talking about garbage disposal, like let's take all of the junk on Earth and put it on a rocket and shoot it into the sun, that's not going to happen. You should put your money into recycling and waste reduction technologies rather than, you know, go dump it somewhere else. My hot take, there's no future for that, using space as a garbage dump. If anything, actually, what you've seen come out of the space problem is a intense focus on recycling and repurposing and remanufacturing and all that kind of stuff. It's you know, sure, space is big and there's lots of stuff, but we're small and we're in a small area and we only have, you know, so many resources immediately available to us. So scarcity is actually still a very big issue.
I'm a big Disney fan. Do you remember WALL-E? Right?
Yeah.
So WALL-E, wasn't he working on a trash compactor in space? So, no, I think the whole idea, that the really cool thing about space is it makes you think about your environment. So whatever you use, you have to figure out how to dispose of while you're traveling there, and it makes you really come back and think about the earth. And again, we're a spaceship here. We have limited resources. We want to use them wisely. So it's an extension of your mindset of how to be good.
Well, it's impossible not to just be so excited about our future, knowing the two of you, and you're such fantastic ambassadors for what could be such a scary, crazy, complex thing. And you always make it so easy to understand and exciting and inspirational. So thank you so much for always finding the time for us. Hopefully this is the first of many interactions you have with the EWC participants, and we're really just so thankful that you always bring such wonderful examples and your own passion to this subject. So thank you guys really a lot for your time today.
Of course, thanks for having us. If anybody wants to reach out to us, find us online, you know, communicate to us via the website. We're out there to help, and we're available. So let us know.
Yep.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks
Stay
for the
safe.
Everybody.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.
All the best.
And we'll see you guys next Tuesday. Have a good one, guys. Stay safe.